One of the ransom notes in the Nancy Guthrie case declared that Nancy Guthrie was dead. Not as a threat. Not as a negotiating position. Not as a conditional, "she will die if you do not comply." As a statement of completed fact. Present tense then past. She was dead. The note said so. Someone wrote those words, sealed them into a document, and introduced them into a federal investigation while the family was still waiting to hear whether Nancy was alive. The person who had to receive that information is a woman who has spent her entire professional life deciding what to believe. Savannah Guthrie has sat at a news desk for decades. She has covered elections and disasters and disappearances and wars. She has delivered the worst news in the world, confirmed, sourced, verified, to audiences of millions with the composure the job demands. She knows what a credible document looks like. She knows the difference between a confirmed claim and a probable one and a planted one. She has built her career on exactly that distinction. And then someone wrote that her mother was dead and she had to evaluate it. That is not a hypothetical or a theory. That happened. It is in the federal record. That is this case right now. Not just the question of whether the note was real, but the question of who writes that sentence, who decides to tell a family their missing mother is dead, and what the answer to that question reveals about the person who sent it. Named sources. Confirmed contacts. On the record. This program does not traffic in assumption dressed as analysis. What follows is built from documented institutional reporting, public statements made on the record, and the logical framework that emerges when the evidence is laid in sequence without flinching from where it points. Subscribe to Missing People Files before this continues. This channel does not move on when the news cycle does. Nancy Guthrie's case will be covered here for as long as it remains unsolved. Hit subscribe now. The tip line is pinned in the description below. If anyone watching has specific information, not a theory, specific knowledge of something connected to this case, that link is there. Use it. Then stay through to the end, because this episode reaches a conclusion about the note's author that has not been stated plainly anywhere else. Nancy Guthrie lived in Tucson, Arizona. She had a home she maintained, a life with specific shape, routines that marked her days, relationships that gave those days their meaning. She was not a public figure. She did not seek this kind of attention. She was someone's mother, in the most particular, irreducible sense of that word, and the person she was a mother to is one of the most recognizable journalists in the United States. Savannah Guthrie has been a fixture of American morning news for years. Her career spans courtrooms, press briefings, the White House lawn, and the anchor desk. She has spent those years in the business of source evaluation, a discipline that sounds like a professional skill until it becomes personal. Source evaluation at its core is the practice of deciding who to believe and what the evidence actually says, under pressure, in real time when the stakes are high. It is a skill Nancy's daughter has exercised thousands of times over the course of a career. She is now exercising it on her own mother's case. That is not a minor detail about the family dynamics of the probe. It is the central emotional condition of this investigation, and it has shaped every public statement Savannah Guthrie has made about the evidence. When she says she tends to believe the first two ransom notes are real, that is not a casual comment from a grieving family member who does not understand how these things work. That is a credentialed evaluator of sourcing and documentation making a considered judgment under the worst possible circumstances. She looked at those notes and made a professional assessment. And then someone wrote that Nancy was dead. Prior episodes of Missing People Files have built out the full timeline of Nancy's disappearance from her Tucson home. The evidence of a struggle, the wrench attack theory, the chain of notes that followed, the forensic linguistic analysis in episode 6 that identified the phrase, "buried with nature," as a potentially traceable cultural marker, and the psychological profile in episode 7 that mapped the behavioral signature of whoever was responsible. The groundwork has been laid. The case has been examined from multiple angles by credentialed experts on the record. This episode is about one specific document, what it said, why someone wrote it, and what the act of writing it reveals about who sent it. Two primary sources shape the analysis in this episode. The first is Reuters news agency. Reuters is an international wire service with more than a century of institutional sourcing standards. Their report, published and attributed to a source with direct knowledge of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, states that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has determined all of the ransom notes connected to this case are not real. Every note, including the first two, the ones that contain specific, accurate information about the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home, and the one that declared her dead. The FBI's position, according to that source, is that none of them are authentic communications from a kidnapper. That report is the factual foundation this episode builds from. It is treated here with the weight its sourcing commands, a serious claim from a credentialed institutional outlet, while the full implications of what it means are examined without softening them. The second source is Savannah Guthrie herself. Nancy's daughter is an anchor with decades of professional experience in the evaluation of sources and documentation. Her public statements about the ransom notes, specifically her statement that she tends to believe the first two are real, were made on the record. She did not say it casually. She said it after examining the evidence available to her, with the professional context she has spent a career building. Her position, and the specific tension between that position and the Reuters report, sits at the center of what this episode examines. These are the sources named on the record. The analysis that follows is built on them. Before the notes are examined in sequence, one thing deserves to be stated plainly. The Reuters report does not resolve this case. It does not name a suspect. It does not explain what happened to Nancy Guthrie or where she is. What it does is shift the analytical ground beneath the investigation in a specific and measurable direction. And that shift, examined carefully against what the notes themselves actually contained, points toward a set of conclusions about the person who wrote them that are more specific than most coverage of this report has acknowledged. The argument that the notes are fake is not the end of the evidentiary thread. It is the beginning of a different one. And that different thread is what this episode follows. Multiple ransom notes arrived in connection with this case. Not one. Not two. Multiple documents, over a period of time, each one introducing new claims into a federal inquiry that was still trying to establish its basic framework. They were not all treated equally. Federal agents and the broader investigative team who followed this case closely, including the forensic experts who appeared in prior episodes of this series, drew distinctions between the notes based on their content, their specificity, and their internal logic. The later ones, the documents that accumulated as the case attracted public attention, were viewed with greater skepticism. The language was more generic. The details were less specific. The probability that they were the work of individuals inserting themselves into a high-profile case for their own reasons, attention, information, disruption, was higher. The first two occupied a different category. The initial document contained specific, accurate information about the interior of Nancy Guthrie's home. Not general descriptions drawn from publicly available photographs or media coverage. Specific details about the physical layout of a private residence. Details that a fraudster constructing a kidnapping scenario from news coverage and social media would not have access to. The correct details in that opening communication came from somewhere. From someone who had been inside that home, or from someone who received that information directly from a person who had. The Bureau took the first note seriously for exactly that reason. The specificity was either genuine, the product of someone who actually held Nancy, or it was the product of someone with intimate knowledge of her private space. Neither of those explanations points toward a stranger. The document that followed declared that Nancy Guthrie was dead. Consider what comes between those two pieces of correspondence. The initial note established credibility through accurate interior detail. The second used that credibility, the credibility purchased through specific verifiable information, to deliver a declaration. She was dead. This is what happened. This is where the case ends. Ask yourself how those two documents function together as a sequence. A single note with accurate house details and a ransom demand is an abduction scenario. Two notes where the first establishes credibility and the second uses that credibility to declare the subject's death is something else entirely. It is a constructed narrative with a beginning and an ending, delivered in sequence. The first says, "Believe me, I know what I am talking about." The second says, "And here is what I am telling you." That sequence has an author. And that author knew what they were doing. Here is what the sequence tells anyone willing to read it in the order it arrived. The opening note was not a demand. It was an audition. It was the author establishing their right to be taken seriously, demonstrating that they possessed information that could only come from access to Nancy Guthrie's private spaces. Not from a news report. Not from a neighbor's account. From being there or from someone who was. The note said in effect, "I am credible. I know things about this home that only someone with proximity could know. Now listen to what I tell you next." And what the author told them next was that Nancy was dead. The sequencing matters because it reveals a level of strategic thinking that is inconsistent with opportunistic attention-seeking and consistent with someone who understood exactly what they needed to accomplish and exactly which order to accomplish it in. Credibility first. Conclusion second. The conclusion was built to stand on the credibility of the first note like a structure built on a prepared foundation. Without the first, the second carries no weight. With the first, The second becomes something investigators have to take seriously. That is not improvisation. That is planning. The second note did not say Nancy Guthrie was in danger. It did not threaten harm if conditions were not met. It did not extend any timeline or escalate a demand. It declared that she had died. Past tense. Completed. Finished. Sit with that, not as an investigative detail but as a human act. Someone wrote those words knowing they would be read by federal agents. Knowing they would enter the official record of an active case. Knowing that the family of the woman named in those words, including a daughter with a national platform and the professional capacity to evaluate documents, would eventually learn what they said. Someone made the deliberate choice to put those words into a document and send them. What does that choice require of the person who made it? A genuine kidnapper does not benefit from declaring the subject dead. The subject's continued life is the only leverage a kidnapper possesses. The moment someone who claimed to be holding Nancy announced that she was already gone, they eliminated the thing that made their communication worth responding to. A genuine kidnapper demanding money or concessions does not write that second document. Consider what category of person does write it. A fraudster who inserts themselves into high-profile missing person cases for attention typically constructs language that extends the drama. They hint at details. They promise revelations. They position themselves as the holder of something valuable, knowledge, access, a thread that could be pulled, without ever fully delivering. Someone in that category does not benefit from closing the loop with a death declaration. Closed loops stop generating attention. The drama ends. The fraudster loses the stage. The category of person who benefits from declaring Nancy dead, specifically in a document introduced into an active federal case, at a moment when agents were still treating the situation as a live abduction, is much narrower than either of those. Think about what a death declaration accomplishes in a federal inquiry. It shifts the operational posture of the entire case. A live abduction invests enormous resources in recovery, surveillance of potential locations, live tips management, active negotiation protocols, the full infrastructure of a rescue operation. A declared death shifts the probe from rescue to homicide. The questions change. The timeline changes. The resource allocation changes. The emotional posture of everyone involved changes. And critically, the urgency of a live search, the kind that turns over every stone before another day passes, that urgency dissipates. What does it mean that those words arrived early, before there was any independent confirmation of Nancy's fate? It means that whoever wrote them either knew she was dead because they were responsible for her death, or because they had been told she was dead by someone who was, or because they needed federal agents to treat her as dead before they had any evidence that she was. Every one of those alternatives points toward the same kind of knowledge. Knowledge from the inside. Not from news coverage. Not from public reporting. From proximity to what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie. Ask yourself why someone with that specific kind of knowledge would want investigators treating her death as confirmed as early as possible. The answer to that question is where this case is centered right now. There is a framework for thinking about who writes a death declaration in a fraudulent document, and it is not complicated. A random fraudster's tool is ambiguity, not closure. Their language keeps the inquiry's attention on them for as long as possible. A death declaration closes the story someone in that position is trying to stay inside. It removes the mystery, it ends the drama they were using to sustain their own involvement. Attention seekers do not write documents that end things. The person who writes a death declaration in a fraudulent note, after first establishing credibility through accurate, specific details of a victim's private home, is not seeking attention. They are seeking to redirect something. The investigation's posture. The family's emotional orientation. The public's understanding of what happened. They want the people looking at this case to stop looking in one direction and start looking in another. Consider what direction that shift serves. A live abduction investigation spends its resources looking for Nancy alive, interviewing witnesses who might have seen her, monitoring locations where a captive might be held, managing a tip line designed to find a living person. A homicide inquiry, triggered by a death declaration, redirects those resources. It asks different questions. It looks in different places. It operates on a different timeline with different urgency. The two are not interchangeable. The person who wanted one rather than the other had a reason for the preference. The person who benefits from a homicide framework rather than an active rescue operation is someone who knows that a live search will either find Nancy or find evidence that leads to whoever is responsible. The author of that death declaration was, in some form, trying to preempt that search, to redirect the apparatus before it moved in the direction that posed the most danger. That is not a stranger's objective. Strangers do not have specific objectives tied to the direction of a particular federal investigation. They do not possess enough knowledge of the inquiry's mechanics to understand which investigative posture is more dangerous to them and which is less. What does that tell the case? The author of that second document had enough understanding of how investigations work, and enough personal stake in how this one developed, to calculate which framing was safer. They chose to introduce a death declaration early. They chose to use the credibility of the initial note to make the second one land. They understood that the sequence would be read, evaluated, and acted upon. That is a sophisticated act. Not sophisticated in the way of someone who has studied criminal procedure abstractly, but in the way of someone who had specific reasons to want this case going in a specific direction and who was willing to put those reasons into a federal document to get there. The author of these documents was not reacting. They were anticipating. They understood, before the notes arrived, that an abduction inquiry and a homicide inquiry are not the same instrument. They chose the framing that protected them more. And they backed that choice with accurate interior details, because they understood the notes would be evaluated on exactly that standard. Do they contain information only a genuine actor would possess? They did possess it. Not because they were a kidnapper. Because they had access to Nancy Guthrie's private space through some other means. That is the fact the case is now working from. Not who kidnapped Nancy, but who knew enough about her home to construct a document that passed initial scrutiny, and who had enough at stake in the probe's direction to use that knowledge to write one. The person who sent those notes has been living with that choice for more than a year. Every news report about this case. Every episode of this series. Every Reuters article and court filing and tip line update. They have been watching the inquiry move and measuring the distance between where it sits and where it would need to be to reach them. That distance is not fixed. It is shrinking. Tick-tock. Ask yourself who in Nancy Guthrie's life had a specific reason to want federal agents treating her death as confirmed rather than pursuing her as missing. Reuters is reporting that the FBI has concluded all of the notes are not real. If that determination is accurate, it does not simplify the case. It complicates it in a specific direction. A genuine ransom note from a kidnapper, even if the kidnapper is not identified, is evidence of one thing: an abduction. It narrows the analytical framework to the scenario it describes. A fraudulent note is evidence of two things simultaneously: the crime against the victim and the act of note writing itself, which is a separate offense with a separate author who had a separate motivation. If the Reuters report is accurate, the Bureau is now working two interlocking questions, not one. What happened to Nancy Guthrie? And who wrote the documents designed to control how that question was investigated? Those two questions may have the same answer. The person who wrote the notes may be the same person responsible for Nancy's disappearance. But they are not necessarily the same person, and that possibility matters enormously to what the investigation is able to build. Consider the alternative. A person exists who knows what happened. They did not act alone, or they were told what happened afterward by someone who did, or they were present for some portion of what occurred. They understood that a live abduction inquiry was dangerous, that the resources of an active rescue search pointed in a direction that would eventually reach them or reach the person they were protecting. They constructed two documents. The opening note established credibility through accurate interior details they had access to because of their proximity to Nancy or her home. The declaration that followed used that credibility to announce a completed death, shifting the probe away from rescue and toward a homicide framework that posed less immediate danger. If that is the sequence, and the architecture of the two notes is consistent with it, then the note writer may not be the primary actor. They may be someone who knew enough, was close enough, and had enough to lose to take an extraordinary step, manufacturing federal evidence to redirect a federal investigation. That person is in this picture somewhere. And the Bureau's determination that the notes are not real brings them measurably closer to the center of the frame. That distinction matters more than it might appear on the surface. Evidence of a kidnapper's communication tells investigators about the kidnapper, their demands, their location, their communication style. Evidence of a note-writer's communication tells something different: what they wanted the inquiry to believe, and what they were trying to prevent it from discovering. A fraudulent document is not neutral evidence. It is directional. It points toward what the person who produced it needed to conceal. The first note needed investigators to believe the interior details were credible, and they were, because the author had access to them. The declaration that followed needed the Bureau to believe Nancy was dead, and it used the opening note's credibility to make that claim land. Each was designed to accomplish something specific. Examined as evidence of intent rather than surface content, Each document tells the federal probe something specific about what that author was protecting. Savannah Guthrie said publicly that she tends to believe the first two notes are real. Hold that statement next to everything it required her to do to reach it. She is a journalist. Credibility evaluation is not an abstract concept for her. It is the operating procedure of every professional day. She reads documents, she parses sourcing, she separates what a source says from what a source knows, and she reaches conclusions with appropriate calibration based on the weight of the available evidence. She has done that for decades, professionally, under conditions where getting it wrong has consequences. She applied that framework to her own mother's case. When Nancy's daughter said she tends to believe the first two notes, not all of them, specifically the first two, she was drawing exactly the same distinction that federal agents drew. The internal hierarchy. The opening note's specific interior details. The death declaration that followed, delivered with the credibility the first had established. She parsed those documents the way she has spent her career parsing documents, and she reached a conclusion that aligned with the most serious investigative assessment. Those two specifically merit being taken at their word. That is not a small thing to have done. To be the daughter and to still apply the standard, to not let grief or hope collapse the analytical distance that professional discipline demands, is an act of rigor that costs something. Every journalist who has covered a story with personal stakes knows the labor of holding the framework in place when everything in the person behind it wants the framework to bend toward a more bearable answer. Nancy's daughter held it. She said what she believed with the appropriate qualification, tends to believe, not certainty, not certainty's absence, but the honest middle ground that evidence of this kind deserves. What that calibration tells the case is specific. Savannah Guthrie has seen more documents in her professional life than most people will encounter in a lifetime. She has read sourced reports and planted stories and press releases dressed as journalism and official statements designed to obscure rather than reveal. She knows, at a practiced level, what it feels like when something reads as constructed versus when something reads as real. She looked at the first two notes and said they read as real. That judgment came from a professional with the most personal possible stake in getting it right. It deserves to be weighed with that context, even as the Reuters report places it in tension with what the FBI's source is now saying. The tension between those two positions, a credentialed evaluator who says the first two notes are real, and a federal source telling Reuters that none of them are, is not a contradiction that cancels out into uncertainty. It is a data point about how persuasive those first two notes were. They were persuasive enough to earn the credence of someone who evaluates documents professionally. If they were fraudulent, whoever produced them wrote with enough skill and enough inside knowledge to clear that bar. But Reuters is now reporting the Bureau's source says all of them were false. Consider what it means for her to receive that report. She is the daughter of the woman named in these documents. She is also the professional most qualified of anyone in this family to evaluate the credibility of what Reuters is claiming. She has the personal stake that makes the question unbearable, and the professional training that makes her unusually equipped to examine it clearly. That combination, the most vulnerable possible position and the best possible analytical tools, is not a comfort. It is a specific and relentless burden. If the notes are false, all of them, including the one she said she believes, then the declaration that her mother died was written by someone who did not hold Nancy. Someone who was not a kidnapper. Someone who had access to the inside of her home and chose to use that access to construct a document telling a family their loved one was dead. That is not a conclusion that arrives gently. It arrives the way all recalibrations arrive for a journalist who holds herself to a standard, with the full weight of what it means that she evaluated those documents carefully, reached a considered position, and that position may now be displaced not by new evidence about the crime but by the Bureau's determination about a forger. The worst part of the Reuters report, for a daughter who is also a journalist, may not be what it says about the investigation. It may be what it says about the person who wrote the notes. A kidnapper sending news of a death, even false news, even strategic news, is at least doing so in the context of a crime being committed against someone they hold. The cruelty is instrumental. The person who manufactures a death declaration with no captive, who researches the interior of a home, who crafts a credible sequence of documents designed to move a federal inquiry in a specific direction, and who does it knowing that a family will have to receive that news, that person is doing something colder than a kidnapper. They are doing something deliberate without the mitigating pressure of an active crime in progress. The journalist in Savannah Guthrie is still asking the question. The daughter in her has to live inside the answer while it remains open. Consider what it means to sit with both of those things at once. The training that tells you to follow the evidence wherever it leads. and the personal reality that following it means accepting that someone chose, deliberately, to write those words about your mother and send them. There is a specific cruelty in that act that goes beyond the crime it was designed to conceal. A kidnapper who sends a death declaration because Nancy actually died in the course of whatever happened. That is terrible, but it is at least connected to the reality of what occurred. A person who manufactures that declaration, who writes that she died without knowing or without having caused it, who uses accurate interior details to make the document credible, that person has done something to the family that is entirely separate from the crime against Nancy. They have taken the worst possible news and delivered it as a deliberate instrument, knowing a daughter would read it, knowing it would land. Not a kidnapper reporting a tragic outcome. Not a stranger making a frightened mistake. Someone who constructed a sequence of documents, included accurate insider details to establish credibility, and then used that credibility to write those words about someone's mother. That specificity, the sequencing, the architecture, the deliberate use of one note to load the next, is not grief. It is not guilt. It is not the behavior of someone who could not help themselves or did not understand what they were doing. It is the behavior of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and did it anyway. Ask yourself what you call a person who makes that choice. There is a person in this case who has not been identified. Not the primary perpetrator. Not the individual whose DNA may be present in the biological evidence recovered from Nancy Guthrie's home. Not the person most directly responsible for her disappearance. There is a person who knew the inside of Nancy's house. Who understood that a live abduction investigation was dangerous. Who constructed a document with accurate interior details to establish credibility, and then used that credibility to declare Nancy Guthrie dead. Who introduced those documents into a federal inquiry at its earliest phase, when the direction of it was still being set. That person made a series of choices. Every one was deliberate. Every one required knowledge, of the home, of the inquiry's likely response, of the mechanics of how a credible document would be evaluated by federal agents, of the specific posture shift a death declaration would trigger. Each of those choices left a trace. The trace is in the documents. The documents are in the possession of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Consider what that trace actually contains. The author of the first note chose which interior details to include. Those details were accurate, which means they were either from memory or from notes. Someone who had been inside Nancy Guthrie's home, or who had been given a description of it by someone who had looked at a blank page and chose what to write. Every detail they included is a data point about their access. Every detail they chose to leave out is a data point about their judgment. The note was not written carelessly. It was written with enough precision to pass the scrutiny of investigators who were actively looking for reasons to dismiss it, and it passed. The author knew the standard. They wrote to meet it. The author of the second note then chose to say Nancy was dead. Not missing. Not in danger. That word, that specific, final, declarative word, was chosen deliberately. It was chosen because it accomplishes something specific in a federal case that missing and in danger do not. It closes a rescue chapter. And the person who chose it understood that before they put it on the page. The determination that the notes are not real does not make that trace disappear. It makes it more legible because fraudulent documents reveal their authors in ways that authentic communications do not. A genuine note is evidence of the sender's demands. A fraudulent document, constructed to redirect a federal inquiry, delivered in a calculated sequence, built on accurate insider knowledge, is a portrait of its author's thinking. It shows what they knew, what they feared, and what they were willing to do to protect themselves from it. That portrait is now in the hands of the Bureau. The investigation is not at a dead end. It is at a specific juncture. The DNA evidence recovered from Nancy's home, a rootless hair from a mixed sample, examined in detail in the prior episode of this series, remains in active analysis. The genealogical search that follows the extraction of that evidence is running. A volunteer search organization has submitted a 41-page operational plan to the Pima County Sheriff's Office requesting permission to search the desert terrain surrounding Tucson. Terrain that, if Nancy was transported from her home, may contain physical evidence that is deteriorating with every month the search does not happen. That permission has not been granted. And attorney Mark Jergo has raised publicly on the record and on News Nation that there may be a person with secondary knowledge of this case, not the primary actor but someone who was told or who witnessed some portion of what happened, who has not yet come forward because the legal consequences of doing so remain undefined. Jergo's argument is that a lawyer can approach law enforcement on that person's behalf, negotiate terms before a single word of information is surrendered, and potentially secure protection for a witness who holds the thread that pulls this case open. None of those paths requires a voluntary confession from the primary perpetrator. The DNA does not need one. The search does not need one. The legal mechanism Gergo describes does not need one. The case has multiple active avenues. The question is which one moves first. The forensic record of this case does not have a gap where the notes used to be. It has a new analytical problem. Two documents constructed in sequence, designed to work together, built from insider knowledge that no stranger could have possessed. Those documents are not less useful to the inquiry now that they have been determined to be fraudulent. They are more useful, because their fraudulence reveals something about their author that genuine communications from a kidnapper never would have. A real kidnapper's note tells you what they want. A fraudulent note built on accurate insider detail and a calculated death declaration tells you what someone needed to protect, what they understood about how investigations work, and how far they were willing to go to steer this one away from the truth. The probe does not announce itself when it gets close. It does not send a signal ahead of time. It narrows quietly, through database matches, through document analysis, through the slow accumulation of verified facts that individually are only pieces, but together form a shape that cannot be explained away. The person who sent those notes has been living alongside this case for more than a year. They have watched it develop. They have seen the forensic linguist examine the language in episode 6. They have seen the profiler build the behavioral map in episode 7. They have seen the DNA evidence discussed in public and the search proposals reported on television and the Reuters report land in the news cycle. They have watched all of it and calculated at each step whether the gap between where the inquiry sits and where they are still feels manageable. Ask yourself how that calculation feels now. Because the Reuters determination changes the terrain. It is not a dead end, it is a redirect. The federal case is no longer building around the content of the notes. It is building around the authorship of the notes. Around who had access to Nancy Guthrie's home, who understood the mechanics of an abduction investigation well enough to redirect one, and who was willing to manufacture federal evidence to do it. That is a narrower field. And a narrower field means fewer places to stand inside it without being seen. Tick-tock. Nancy Guthrie has not been found. There are things that are known about her. She lived in Tucson. She had a home she kept, a daughter she raised, a life with specific texture and meaning to the people who were in it. She was not a public figure. She did not seek this kind of attention. She was someone's mother, a specific person with specific preferences, specific routines, and a specific relationship to the woman who now watches her name scroll across the churn she reads from. Every morning Savannah Guthrie has gone to work since Nancy disappeared. She has carried two things into that building simultaneously. The professional standard her entire career is built on. Follow the evidence, name the sources, do not let feeling collapse the distance between a probable claim and a confirmed one. And the personal reality that the evidence she is following, the sources she is evaluating, the claim she is trying to confirm, it is all about her mother. She held those two things together. She evaluated the notes. She reached a calibrated conclusion. The first two, specifically, are more credible than the rest. She said so publicly with the appropriate qualification because that is what the evidence supported and that is what the standard demands. She did that while being the daughter, while watching the coverage, while knowing that every episode produced by programs like this one, every wire report filed, every tipline call logged is part of a picture she is simultaneously inside of and trying to evaluate from the outside. That is not a position anyone trains for. It is the position this case put her in on the day Nancy disappeared, and it is the position she has occupied every day since. Someone wrote a document saying her mother was dead. They are still out there. They know what they wrote. They know why they wrote it. And they have spent more than a year watching the case circle the territory they occupy, calculating whether the distance is large enough to feel safe. It is not. Nancy Guthrie deserves to be found. Her family deserves to know what happened. And the person who produced those documents, who understood enough about investigations to redirect one, who knew enough about Nancy's home to embed its details in a federal record, who chose to declare a woman dead in writing while her daughter waited for news, should understand something plainly. The notes are evidence. Not just of the crime against Nancy. Of the person who wrote them. The FBI has the documents. The FBI has the determination that they are not real. And the gap between those two facts, between a fraudulent document and the identity of the person who constructed it, is exactly the kind of gap that investigations are built to close. This program will not stop covering this case. The tip line is in the description below. If anyone watching has specific information, not a theory, not a rumor, something specific and verifiable, Use it. It is monitored. It is confidential. Subscribe to Missing People Files. Come back. This channel stays with Nancy Guthrie's case until there is an answer. Because somewhere the answer already exists. Someone already knows it. And the question is simply whether the probe reaches them before they believe it never will. It already has begun.